In May of 1901, Surgeon Joseph Kinyon sat on a train bound for Detroit. He had just spent a little less than 2 years in San Francisco. He had been sent there to do a job, and as far as he and the greater medical community were concerned, he had done it to the best of his ability. Now, he was paying the price. Kinyon's career began in New York in 1886 at the Staten Island Quarantine Station as an assistant surgeon. Since 1878, quarantine stations had worked alongside ports to conduct medical checks on arriving sailors. By all accounts, Kenyon was extremely accomplished and intelligent. In 1887, Kenyon became the first director of the newly founded hygienic laboratory, which would focus its research on epidemic diseases, mainly cholera, yellow fever, smallpox, and the plague. He would then spend a number of years in Europe, experimenting on tuberculin with its creator, Robert Koch. It was on this same trip that Kenyon would come to learn the basic theories of the newly forming scientific fields of immunology and microbiology. In 1891, when the hygienic laboratory was moved to Washington, D.C., Kenyon moved with it. In the same year, the quarantine station's role expanded to cover medical checks of arriving immigrants. This expansion coincided with the federal government's takeover of immigration processing, a job which until then had been handled by the individual states. It was April 27th of 1899 when Walter Wyman, the then Surgeon General, decided to have Kenyon abruptly transferred across the country to the San Francisco quarantine station. This change was by all accounts a demotion. Kenyon would be replaced at the hygienic laboratory by Milton J. Rosenau, a man who was known to be close to Wyman. Though it was the largest station of its kind in the world, the San Francisco station was, due to immense tension between the state and federal health authorities in California, not an appointment Kenyon was looking forward to. There are two contradicting interpretations of Wyman's motivations behind his decision to transfer Kenyon. Either Wyman saw Kenyon as a threat and he was looking to move him out of D.C., or Wyman wanted to place someone he could trust in charge of San Francisco. Kenyon believed the answer to be the former. Either way, both Kenyon and Wyman feared a possible coming plague epidemic. At this point, the plague had been spreading throughout Asia for around 50 years. It was not a matter of if it would spread to San Francisco, but of when. On the 20th of May, around 50 medical professionals local to D.C. gathered at Rogers to have a send-off dinner for Kenyon. While cigars were being served, Dr. Joseph Tabor Johnson, the toastmaster for the event, stood to give his toast. To Dr. Kenyon as sanitarian, "In thee is seen why there is hope for man, and where we hold the wheel of life at will. Peace go with thee, and comfort all thy days." As the end of May approached, Kenyon and his wife set off on their journey to the West Coast. Kenyon arrived in San Francisco on June 11th. It was unusually hot. A heat wave had seemingly followed them as they crossed the country. In the early morning hours of the 13th, Kenyon would receive his first real taste of San Francisco when he was awoken by an earthquake, an omen of what was to come. With the quarantine station being located on Angel Island, Kenyon's first up-close glimpse of it would have been from the deck of a ferry. He later remarked that the location would have been the most beautiful sight for a summer hotel that he had ever seen in all of his travels. Despite the location, the structure itself was falling into disrepair, having had no improvements made on it in 5 years. Kenyon would officially take charge of the station a week later. His first scandal wouldn't be far behind. The Japanese steamship Nippon Maru docked in San Francisco on the 27th of June. Kenyon and a Dr. Mathewson boarded it for a health inspection. All passengers were found in good health, but, due to an incidence of plague earlier in its journey, the ship was marked for quarantine and sanitization. The following day, while removing the crew and cargo for sanitization, 7 stowaways were discovered on board. A few hours later, the bodies of 2 men would be found floating near the Golden Gate Bridge. Each man was wearing a life preserver, and both life preservers had on them the name of the ship to which they belonged. They both read, Nippon Maru. According to the remaining stowaways, they had been informed that if they were discovered, they would be returned to Japan. After learning that the ship would be emptied for sanitization, they hatched a plot to swim to shore. In the end, only 2 of them would take the plunge. It was around 3 in the morning when the 2 men, against better judgment, jumped overboard into the icy cold water and were dragged away by San Francisco Bay's notorious currents. The bodies fell into the hands of the city. After only 12 hours of investigation, City Health Board bacteriologist Dr. John Henry Barbet declared that both of the deceased had been infected with the plague. At the time, the only truly accurate way of diagnosing plague was through animal inoculation, but animal inoculation was a time-consuming process that the city health laboratories were not equipped to perform. Barbet's diagnosis instead came from viewing slides in a microscope. The city's claim of plague quickly reached the newspapers, who printed it as fact. Kenyon pushed against this and asked for the cultures in order to perform further tests, only to be informed that Barbet, afraid that the cultures themselves were liable to spread the disease, had disposed of them. All that remained of Barbet's investigation was photographs he had taken of the sample slides under his microscope. On July 1st, these images, along with new samples from the body, were brought to Angel Island, where Kenyon came to the conclusion that the bacteria were spherical in shape rather than the rod-shaped plague bacteria. The newspapers quickly turned against Barbet, claiming that his actions were politically motivated. Mainly that he was hoping that faking plague would allow him to increase the budget of the San Francisco Board of Health. Barbet would later leave the board a few months later. Throughout the affair, state quarantine officials continually attempted to take control of the situation away from Kenyon. The state argued that it was solely the right of the state to make quarantine decisions, a power which had been slowly stripped from the states for the past 2 years. To Kenyon's surprise, after this incident, the city and state health officials gradually began to back his efforts. For the first time, the city, state, and federal health authorities in California were working together. In January of 1900, the City Health Board of San Francisco went as far as to dissolve the city quarantine department, formally handing over control of quarantine matters to the federal government. Kenyon truly believed that matters in California would continue to improve. The Chinese had been living in San Francisco for as long as the city had existed. But life for the Chinese in the United States was not at all simple. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was fairly common for Chinatowns to be purposefully demolished. In the 1880s, both Denver, Colorado, and Tacoma, Washington, saw their Chinatowns destroyed by riots. In California, San Jose and Pacific Groves were suspiciously burnt down, while in Los Angeles, Chinatown was forced to move to make way for the construction of Union Station. San Francisco's Chinatown had, save for a small riot in July of 1877, evaded this fate. But it was not for lack of trying. As San Francisco grew, the Chinese unintentionally found themselves at the center of the city. Though initially built along the coast, projects to fill in parts of the bay pushed Chinatown a few blocks back from the water. This new land to the east became the financial and business district of San Francisco. The hills to the north and west of Chinatown became affluent neighborhoods. This meant that for the wealthy, a trip downtown meant going through Chinatown. This made it impossible to ignore. Through the late 1800s, many political pushes and legal declarations came and went, calling for their removal. Every single one would fail for one reason or another. Most of these cases centered on the fact that the presence of the Chinese, as well as Chinatown itself, was a blight on the city. In William Heath Davis's memoir detailing his life in early California, he describes a visit to Chinatown in 1886 with a Mr. John McDermott from Washington, D.C., saying, "We visited Chinatown, and I took him into basements and cellars which were inhabited by Chinese, and the smell from the filth that surrounded their habitations was so offensive that he and I were glad to retreat to the street above us and into the pure air." To most San Franciscans, Chinatown was a slum, but to the Chinese, it was still far better than what they had left behind. Though many people at the time attributed Chinatown's filth and dilapidated appearance to the Chinese themselves, they were not truly at fault. In San Francisco, very few buildings in Chinatown were actually owned by the Chinese. In fact, for a portion of its history, Chinese could not legally own property. Instead, they signed long leases with absentee landlords who refused to renovate or repair their buildings. Due to this, Chinatown was in extreme disrepair. In many areas, it even lacked a proper sewage system. Overcrowding was also a common issue. It was these very conditions that allowed the plague to take root. On March 6, 1900, city physician Frank P. Wilson responded to a call from an embalmer in Chinatown. A Chinese man named Wang Chut-king had passed away in the basement of the Globe Hotel. Wilson was to perform a cursory post-mortem examination, then issue the death certificate. It was a routine duty. This particular call, though, would turn out to be anything but routine. As Wilson conducted the examination, he noticed that the man's lymph nodes near his groin were swollen. Knowing that this was a symptom of plague, Wilson called for the new city bacteriologist Wilfred Harvey Kellogg. Kellogg had recently replaced Barbet as the city bacteriologist. Having only recently graduated, he was seen by many of his coworkers as too young and inexperienced for the position. But, with bacteriology being a new field, bacteriologists were hard to come by. His predecessor, Barbet, for instance, actually specialized in surgery. Kellogg examined samples through a microscope, and upon realizing what he was looking at, he called City Health Officer A.P. O'Brien. O'Brien then took this information to the then president of the City Board of Health, John Williamson, and pushed for a quarantine to be placed on the whole district of Chinatown. When dealing with diseases, it was common to quarantine singular persons or a singular house, but a whole district was unusual. Furthermore, the two still needed to confirm their diagnosis. Yet, despite these issues, the board decided to err on the side of caution and ordered the quarantine. Knowing that the city lacked the proper equipment to properly diagnose plague, Kellogg brought the cultures to Angel Island for Kenyon to examine. There, Kenyon inoculated 4 animals, 1 rat, 2 guinea pigs, and 1 monkey. On the morning of March 7th, citizens of San Francisco awoke to find Chinatown placed under a strict quarantine. Ropes blocked its roads, and policemen guarded its perimeter. No Chinese were allowed in or out. As it was a singular, unconfirmed case, most people in San Francisco were not initially worried. To Californian Governor Henry T. Gage, plague in California would be an economic disaster. Gage was by all definitions a cog in the Southern Pacific Railroad political machine. He had worked for them as a corporate lawyer since the 1870s, and in turn they helped him secure the nomination for the state Republican convention, which would lead him to winning governorship in the 1898 elections by 7%. To him, the simplest way to deal with plague was to deny that it existed at all. As days passed without a confirmation, more and more newspaper articles made claims that the plague situation was a complete farce. These claims mostly came from the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Francisco Call, both of which were owned by men who had connections to the Southern Pacific Railway. Due to this growing public pressure, the quarantine was dropped on the 10th, after only 3 days. This was taken by the people as confirmation that plague did not truly exist in San Francisco. The following day, Kinyoun walked into his lab to find that the rat and both guinea pigs were dead. The monkey would outlive them by 2 days. Upon examination, it was confirmed that all of the animals had died of plague. On May 15th, they had 4 confirmed cases of plague. The cases were spread out across Chinatown, and no connections between the deceased could be made. It is at this point that Kenyon, in a telegram to Wyman, declared the situation an epidemic. In the days immediately following, Kenyon met with the Chinese Consul General Ho Yao, Chinese Six Company's attorney John Bennett, representatives of the San Francisco Merchants Association, and the City Board of Health to discuss vaccination of the Chinese with the half-keen vaccination. All of those in attendance stated that the Chinese and Japanese would gladly be vaccinated in order to avoid more severe measures being placed on them. This could not be further from the truth. Rumors of a planned mass vaccination of Chinatown quickly spread. Many Chinese began to gather at the Chinese Six Company's offices to protest against the measure. They were only calmed after a representative promised to retain a lawyer and pursue legal action. Still, many Chinese were apprehensive and feared the half-keen vaccination. The half-keen vaccination was the first effective vaccination against the plague. The main issue was its numerous uncomfortable side effects, including pain at the injection site, fever, and in very rare cases, death. Though it was seen by many as experimental, it increased a person's chances of survival by 50%. On May 18th, Bennett and 2 other lawyers were sent to attempt to convince the health board not to continue with their vaccination plans. These efforts would ultimately fail. At the same time, Wyman ordered Kinyon to inform the railroad companies not to sell tickets to any Chinese or Japanese who did not have a certificate from the Marine Hospital confirming that they had received the vaccination. The following day, the first attempt at vaccination of Chinatown began. It was, by all metrics, a complete and total failure. Though a number of Japanese submitted themselves to vaccination, only a single Chinese man named Ng Pun-chu accepted it. Ng was the owner of the Chinese Western Daily, a popular Chinese-language newspaper, as well as a respected member of the community. He had hoped that his willingness to receive the vaccine would encourage others to also receive it. He could not have been more wrong. As news spread of his action, a mob formed outside his office, threatening him with physical violence. Though Ng would escape unharmed, subscriptions to his newspaper would drop by half. His reputation, at least for a time, was heavily damaged by this event. On May 24th, a legal complaint was filed on behalf of a Chinese merchant named Wang Wai. It alleged that the Board of Health, through limiting the movement of the Chinese and requiring them to receive the half-keen vaccination, were in violation of the Equal Protection Clause by specifically targeting the Chinese. The defendants were listed as the entirety of the San Francisco Board of Health, as well as Kenyon himself. In addition to the legal complaint, a request for a provisional injunction to stop the board's current actions was made. Though it was not granted immediately, Judge Morrow still requested to hear the arguments the next day. The focus of the Chinese representatives was on the side effects of the half-keen vaccine. They also denied the existence of plague in Chinatown outright. The defense, made up of Frank Coombs and Charles Weller, on the other hand, only submitted two pieces of evidence: the Board of Health's May 18th declaration of plague and Wyman's May 21st telegram ordering Kenyon to talk to the transportation companies. Their arguments centered on the unprovable claim that Asian persons were more susceptible to the plague than others. In the end, Morrow would rule in favor of the Chinese, while also saying that, in his opinion, plague did not exist in San Francisco. On the 28th, Dr. George F. Schrady arrived in San Francisco from New York. He was the New York Herald's medical staff reporter, as well as the owner of the medical journal, The Medical Record. He had come on an invitation from John D. Spreckles, then publisher of the San Francisco Call, to help investigate the situation. On his first day in San Francisco, he met with Kenyon and a number of Board of Health members to learn about the situation. The following day, his first article was published. It said much the same as had been told to him at the meeting, mainly that there were currently no known cases in San Francisco. More articles would be published over the following days. Each article became more sensationalized and confusing than the next, to the point where Schrady began calling for the destruction of Chinatown. And he was not the only one. State Board of Health member Dr. Crowley was calling for Chinatown to be burned, a measure which Honolulu took a few months earlier when dealing with their own plague epidemic. This action, though, had ended in disaster, as fires quickly grew out of control, destroying the homes of around 5,000 Chinese living in Honolulu's Chinatown. On the 2nd of June, Schrady attended a dinner at the Cliff House. In attendance at this dinner was Governor Gage, Spreckles, and Dr. Winslow Anderson. What exactly was spoken about at the dinner is unknown, but the following day the Call published an article which heavily contradicted Schrady's earlier statements. Though he had originally intended to stay for a few more days, Schrady quickly fled from San Francisco. While the court case was ongoing and Schrady's articles were still being published, more trouble was brewing. The State Board of Health of Texas placed a travel ban on all persons and items coming from San Francisco. This was a further blow to the railroad companies. In a meeting attempting to rectify the situation, Texas Health Officer Dr. Walter F. Blunt said that if Chinatown was placed under a strict quarantine, then after a period of 30 days the ban would be lifted. And so the State Board of Health gave the San Francisco Board of Health an ultimatum. Either Chinatown be placed in quarantine by the city, or the city of San Francisco in its entirety would be placed under quarantine by the state. And so, the City Board of Health met on May 29th in order to discuss the implementation of a second quarantine on Chinatown. Though they were initially unsure of how they would accomplish this after the Wang Wai case, the state assured them that this would be different, as they were placing a quarantine on a district rather than a people. In part, Morrow's ruling argued that the City Board of Health had acted without the authority to do so. Specifically, they needed the approval of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. On the 30th, the Board of Supervisors did exactly that. The second quarantine of Chinatown began the same day. The following day, the Board of Health held another meeting to discuss local Chinese leaders' calls for provisions to be delivered to Chinatown. There was a rising fear that famine could set in if they went without aid. In the same meeting, it was ordered that every single death in Chinatown would require an autopsy. Many Chinese would push back against these autopsy mandates. It was extremely common for bodies to be sent back to China for burial. Autopsies often hindered this process. The Chinese 6 companies, through their lawyers' request, were allowed to have their own physician present at these autopsies. On June 2nd, this access would be revoked when Dr. Ernest Pillsbury removed the lymph nodes of a deceased Chinese without permission and declared that they had died of syphilis. On June 5th, a bill in equity was filed on behalf of Ju Ho, a grocer living in Chinatown. In it, he stated that his personal liberties to carry on with his business was being interfered with, and that, though the quarantine terms read as applying to the area, the quarantine was in reality only being enforced on the Chinese. Over the past few days, a barrier of wood and barbed wire had been built around Chinatown in an attempt to force the Chinese into accepting an evacuation to Mission Rock. But there was a general fear among the Chinese that if they left, Chinatown would be demolished. Unlike the Wang Wai case, the defense, this time led by attorney J.J. Doon, submitted a long rebuttal of the accusations. To support their claim, a 6 companies attorney, J.C. Campbell, brought the judges to see the quarantine border in person. There they found that the border was built in such a way that homes and businesses of white residents were on the outside, while the Chinese were on the inside. Doon was forced to concede. A number of people would speak at the trial in favor of the Chinese, including Adolf Spreckels, owner of the Spreckels Sugar Company, as well as brother of San Francisco Cobb publisher John Spreckels, Levi Strauss, and former Governor James Budd. Current Governor Henry T. Gage would also speak at the trial, forcefully denying the existence of plague and declaring that all previous post-mortem examinations were unsatisfactory in proving its existence. On June 15th, Judge Morrow once again ruled in favor of the Chinese. The Board of Health would meet the same day to lift the second quarantine, as well as once again allow the 6 companies' physicians to attend autopsies. Also in attendance at this meeting was Charles B. Cooper, president of the Hawaiian Medical Board. Here, he advocated for the burning of Chinatown. To him, as well as a number of others, fire was the only way to truly cleanse plague. Before the Ju Ho case had even ended, Wyman in Washington, D.C. brought the issue of plague to then-President William McKinley, which resulted in presidential approval to use the Act of 1890, which allowed for the federal government to take strict control of interstate travel in order to prevent the spread of infectious disease. On the same day that the court's decision was given, Kenyon once again informed railroad and steamship companies not to allow people without certificates to leave the state. Kenyon's order was general in its terms, applying to all people leaving San Francisco and saying nothing about Asians or the half-keen vaccine. But, to the Chinese, this was simply another veiled attempt to target them specifically. It did not take long for Gage to respond by sending a telegram to President McKinley, referring to the measures as unwanted and unnecessary, since it was the result of the city health officials' false claims of plague. Gage also stated that he feared how this measure would affect California's reputation. He would go as far as to suggest that the Californian Republican Party would turn its back against McKinley. McKinley received similar messages from other government and Republican Party officials. Under this pressure, he would dismiss Kenyon's order. This came with another round of newspaper fire targeting Kenyon. The Nippon Maru incident was even brought back into question. The same papers that had once praised him for his handling of Nippon Maru now claimed that his actions had, in reality, been based on the fact that a number of prominent and wealthy merchants had been aboard the ship. On June 16th, only a day after Kenyon's restrictions were placed, Wang Wai and a number of others came to Kenyon's offices asking for certificates. These requests would be denied. Wang Wai then went to the courts and filed a complaint that Kenyon was in contempt of court for violating the court's injunction. Representatives of the Santa Fe Railroad also submitted a similar complaint. Meanwhile, Kenyon was becoming increasingly suspicious of District Attorney Coombs after he instructed Kenyon to plead guilty, to which Kenyon refused. Kenyon attempted to ask Wyman for legal help to no avail. He would later write that it was as if he had been chosen to be sacrificed. If he was found guilty, he would not only lose his position, but also serve a minimum of 12 months in jail. Kinyoun was prepared to appeal all the way to the Supreme Court out of his own pocket if he had to. On June 25th, Coombs finally promised to submit all communications between Kenyon and Washington, D.C. as evidence. At the same time, Wyman was also becoming suspicious and sent a telegram ordering Coombs to take prompt and vigorous action in order to prevent a guilty verdict. On July 1st, Kenyon, under instruction of Wyman, attempted to meet Judge Morrow in his chambers for an unrelated matter, only to find that he was not there. The following day, while on his way back to Angel Island, Kenyon ran into Morrow on the ferry to Tiburon. The two began to talk, and the conversation eventually came to center on the plague. In all of the previous court cases, Kenyon had not been allowed to give evidence to prove the existence of plague. He saw this moment as his perfect chance, and as they parted, he felt that he had impressed Morrow with the details of the scientific research he had been conducting on the existence of plague in San Francisco. In this chance encounter, Morrow also encouraged Kenyon to come speak with him if he ever needed clarification on the legality of quarantine measures. At the final hearing, Kenyon promised not to institute any new quarantine measures without direct orders from Washington or consent from the governor. On July 3rd, it was ruled that there was insufficient evidence to prove Kenyon's personal role in denying the certificates. Coombs would later be selected by the California Republican Party to run for the House of Representatives that November, which he would go on to win. To Kenyon, this was a reward. State Board of Health members Louis Bassett and Andrew Henderson publicly fought back against Gage's claims. In June, as an act of protest, they resigned. Gage quickly filled their empty positions with his allies, ultimately choosing Dr. Winslow Anderson to be the board's president. Anderson, in turn, assembled his own trio of plague inspectors, consisting of Henry Darchie Power, David Hodgehead, and Ernest Pillsbury. On July 4th, the first living plague patient was discovered with Li Wing Tong. Pillsbury had originally declared his ailment typhoid fever, but after an autopsy he would admit that it was in fact plague. After reporting this discovery to the board, the Chinese 6 companies promptly suspended his services. In August, when Pillsbury reported a second case to the board, he was fired as a medical consultant for the Chinese. As the months dragged on, the newspaper fire would continue. In late December, Wyman, at Kenyon's request, appointed Joseph H. White to conduct an inspection of all Pacific Coast Marine Health Service stations. In the end, White found nothing wrong and even vouched for the reliability of Kenyon's work. Next, a federal commission was created to determine the existence of plague. This commission was headed by Simon Flexer, Frederick Novy, and Llewellyn Barker. All 3 of them had recently returned from studying plague outbreaks in Asia. In late January, upon hearing of the commission's arrival in San Francisco, Gage telegrammed President McKinley asking that the federal commission cooperate with the state authorities. This request was quickly turned down, as the commission was meant to serve as an independent panel. On February 6, the commission began systematic checks of Chinatown. University of California professor of pathology Alonzo Taylor quickly offered up his lab for the commission's use, but university president Benjamin Wheeler objected. Instead, Mayor Phelan gave them an office in City Hall. The Chinese 6 companies were very supportive of this commission, assigning them a translator named Wang Chu. In their first week, they discovered 6 cases of plague. This was in comparison to the local authorities finding only 20 cases in 10 months. Their success was largely thanks to Wang Chun's efforts and connections in the community. From this, it can be assumed that the disease was likely much more prominent than data suggests. The Chinatown investigation concluded on the 16th, and on the same day the commission met with Gage to discuss their findings. Upon hearing the news, Gage became outraged, and once again telegrammed McKinley saying that it was unfair that the state experts were never consulted. As soon as the commission's report was finished, it was suppressed by Wyman. He had already been suppressing plague information since January, even going as far as to leave plague numbers out of the federal public health reports. To Wyman, the commission report was a bargaining chip, one he wanted to use to force Gage into action. Gage had already sent a delegation to Washington. It consisted of John P. Young of the San Francisco Chronicle, Fremont Older of the San Francisco Bulletin, Thomas T. Williams of the San Francisco Examiner, William Herron, Chief Counsel of the South Pacific Railroad, and Henry T. Scott, President of the Union Works. The deal they came to saw continued suppression of the report in return for a silent sanitary campaign. But the report was already quietly being discussed by academics. The health officer, as well as the governor of Texas, both pushed Wyman for details about the report. Then, on April 1st, the Occidental Medical Times would publish it in full. But the deal was already made. The state of California had already attempted twice to pass resolutions calling for Kinyon's removal, and both had failed. In early March, Congress amended the 1893 Quarantine Act, strengthening the federal government's quarantine powers by making it a misdemeanor for local or state authorities to interfere in quarantine matters. This only made Kinyon's enemies more desperate to see him removed. On April 16th, Kenyon was informed of his sudden transfer to Detroit. It's thought that this was part of the agreement between Gage's delegation and Wyman. His enemies had won. Gage would never truly follow through on his side of the deal. 10 days later, Kinyoun, by invitation, would speak at the California Medical Society 1901 annual meeting. Though he was originally only meant to introduce 4 papers, Kinyoun began instead to speak at length about plague, as well as his experiences with it. In case a quarantine or health officer has the misfortune to apprehend or discover a case of plague or cholera, and, obeying the law of the land or the higher law, duty, makes known his discovery, he must be prepared to be subject to every species of abuse known to man. He must be prepared to be made a target by a subsidized press, to submit to all the lowest forms of persecution, simply because he has no more sense than to do his duty, tell the truth. He, of course, is a defender of the almighty dollar, and traducer of all political schemes and business interests. For what do these interests care for life, health, and happiness of the people, so long as the usual percentage are gathered into the spacious maws? Furthermore, it must be known that the machine politics of the state must not be disturbed. It must be kept intact. The public is to be informed by this machine that there is a traitor in the camp, bent with hellish designs on ruining the state. Plague has not and cannot exist in such a helpful place as San Francisco, Oporto, Calcutta, or even Alexandria. Why, those glowing commercial vistas of the Golden Gate would be sufficient in themselves to make even the thought of plague disappear and vanish forever. Even if it were admitted that there may be something like plague among the Chinese, it must be kept quiet, even if the whole machinery of the government, both state and national, be invoked to this end. The quarantine and health officers must be suppressed. If not suppressed, they must be removed. Kenyon was no longer in San Francisco, but the plague continued for a number of years. Though the epidemic was declared over in 1904, cases would continue sporadically until 1908. Even as the reality of the situation became clearer, Gage would continue to deny the existence of plague right up through his final speech as governor. By the end of his term, his political party would abandon him. A few years after his transfer, to the dismay of his colleagues, Kenyon would resign from his position in Detroit. His time in San Francisco had greatly affected him. The newspapers had dragged his name through the mud. At one point, a bounty for $7,000 was placed on his head, causing Kenyon to carry a revolver. When traveling, he would use a pseudonym. He would later admit to having at least 4 mental breakdowns during his stay in San Francisco. Despite these hardships, when given the offer to head the District of Columbia Health Department Bacteriology Laboratory, he took it. He would hold the position until his death in 1919 at the age of 58.